Lightning, they say, does not strike the same place twice. Tragedy, it turns out, is less particular. At one red cottage on the shore of Lake Hjälmar in Sweden, death came calling in 2 consecutive summers. The first time, it wore the face of an accident, a drowning in shallow water, mourned and quietly filed away. The second time, a year on, it left no room for such mercy. And the same person, investigators would slowly come to realize, had been present for both. Göran Möller and his wife spent their summers by Lake Hjälmaren in a little red cottage outside the town of Arboga in central Sweden. It was meant to be a place of rest, a tranquil retreat by the water, where they could tend the garden and enjoy the long Nordic days. On the evening of August 2nd, 2016, the Möllers settled in for another quiet night at their summer cottage. Just after 5 a.m. on August 3rd, Sweden's emergency number 112 lit up with a desperate call from Grannliden, the small lakeside enclave where the Möllers' cottage stood. The caller was a 63-year-old woman, barely able to speak between gasps. It was Göran Möller's wife. She managed to tell the operator, in a trembling voice, that she had been attacked. "I'm seriously hurt," she said. "My husband is lying dead in the bed. Someone came in. Someone did something to us. I think I'm dying." Even over the phone, the dispatcher could hear the raw panic and pain. The line soon went silent, but the message was clear. First responders raced to the scene through the early dawn light. When police and medics arrived at the isolated summer cottage, they walked into a nightmare. Inside the modest bungalow, 68-year-old Göran Möller was found lifeless on the bed he'd been sleeping in. He had been stabbed multiple times in the chest. His wife was found nearby, barely conscious and drenched in blood from severe stab wounds of her own. The bedroom told a chaotic story, blood on the sheets and floor, signs of a violent struggle, yet no obvious trail leading in or out. Outside, overnight rain had soaked the ground, likely washing away any footprints or tire tracks that the attacker might have left. There was no weapon left behind, and no sign of forced entry. Paramedics fought to stabilize Göran's wife. Despite deep lacerations and the tremendous blood loss that had left her on the brink of death, she was still alive. She was rushed to a nearby hospital where doctors would perform emergency surgery to save her life. Göran, however, was beyond saving. The quiet summer holiday had turned into a horrific crime scene. Investigators from the Västmanland County Police began canvassing the area that morning, trying to piece together what had happened while the couple slept. At first, nothing about the scene made sense. A violent knife attack on a sleeping older couple is not a typical burglary scenario, certainly not in rural Sweden where violent home invasions are rare. Yet nothing appeared to be stolen from the Möllers' cottage. The furnishings were undisturbed aside from the traces of the struggle. The family car was still parked outside. There were no broken windows, jimmy marks, or pried locks. No obvious forced entry at all. The possibility emerged that the attacker might have been someone the couple knew, or someone who had access to a key. In those earliest hours, the police had to consider every angle. One unsettling possibility was that this could have been a murder-suicide or a domestic incident. Could Göran's wife have, in theory, attacked her husband and then herself? It was a fleeting thought. Detectives have a duty to consider even unlikely scenarios. But it didn't fit. The severity of the woman's wounds and her genuine anguish on the phone did not align with a staged scene. She had been brutally stabbed in the chest and limbs, injuries difficult to inflict on oneself. Investigators quickly realized that Göran's wife was not a suspect, but a second victim who had barely survived an attack. As soon as her condition allowed, she would be a key witness. Later that day in the hospital, as Göran's wife came out of surgery and was recovering in intensive care, detectives carefully interviewed her about what she remembered. Her recollections were hazy. The attack had come while they were asleep, and it was dark. She recalled waking to unimaginable pain and confusion. A figure had been in their bedroom, stabbing wildly at them. She could not clearly see a face in the darkness and chaos. But she knew it was not her husband attacking her. Göran's wife did offer one critical clue that caught the detectives off guard. When asked if anyone might have had a motive to harm them, or if they had any enemies, the injured woman whispered an unexpected name, Johanna Müller, their own daughter. She told the investigators, in a voice filled with a mixture of fear and regret, that Johanna was the only person she could imagine who might wish to hurt them. It was a startling accusation, one the police did not take lightly. Why would a daughter want to attack her own parents? On the surface, it sounded unthinkable. Yet the officers listening to Göran's wife realized this family had a recent history of tragedy, and Johanna Müller was often at the center of it. Johanna, 42, lived in the city of Eskilstuna, about 30 miles east of Arboga. Johanna was known to be outspoken, ambitious, and lately troubled. In fact, the family had endured another horrifying incident just 1 year earlier. In August 2015, almost exactly a year before the Cottage attack, Johanna's husband had died during a visit to this same summer property. That time, it was Johanna who had phoned emergency services from Granliden, sounding frantic and distraught. She reported that her husband, 42-year-old Aki Pasila, was missing. According to Johanna's account, he had gone out in a small boat on the lake in the evening and never returned. She said she fell asleep, and when she woke in the early hours of morning, the boat was gone, and her husband was nowhere to be found. A search was launched, and Aki's body was discovered in the lake's shallow water near the cottage's pier. The death was tragic, but at the time not considered suspicious. He had drowned in barely 1 meter of water. The authorities ruled it an accident, perhaps a night swim or boat outing gone wrong. Johanna, widowed with children to care for, was treated sympathetically as a grieving wife who had suffered a freak misfortune. But after the violent attack on Göran and his wife, that old drowning incident suddenly took on a more sinister cast. Detectives who knew the family's history began to wonder, could it really be a coincidence that 2 deadly incidents struck the Müllers at the same cottage, almost exactly 1 year apart? Göran's wife certainly didn't think it was a coincidence. In her hospital bed, she implied that Johanna might be behind both events. She did not have proof, but she had deep suspicions born of things only a mother might observe. The police took this statement seriously. They knew it was delicate. A gravely injured woman implicating her own daughter in a capital crime. Was this the shock and trauma speaking, or the truth finally coming to light? To get to the bottom of it, investigators began digging into Johanna Müller's recent life. What they found only increased their suspicions. Johanna's life was complex and filled with dramatic turns. She was a mother of several children, and after her husband Aki's death, she had presented herself publicly as a bereaved single mother, trying to move on. But less than a year into her widowhood, Johanna had become involved with someone new, someone much younger. She had taken a teenage asylum seeker into her home, officially as a foster arrangement for a refugee minor, which was something she'd done before as part of Sweden's efforts to house unaccompanied refugee youth. This young man's name was Mohammed Rajabi, and he was around 19 or 20 years old in 2016. Johanna often referred to Mohammed as a foster son, or simply a tenant renting a room. In reality, their relationship had become secretive and romantic. Family acquaintances later recalled that Johanna and Mohammed behaved more like a couple than a guardian and ward. Despite their significant age difference, she was more than twice his age. They were having an affair. Johanna's involvement with Mohammed Rajabi was not the only controversial aspect of her life just then. Only a few months earlier, she had run into trouble with the authorities over her work with refugee youths. Johanna had been operating a small hostel or group home for asylum-seeking teenagers, but regulators forced her to shut it down. There were even murmurs of inappropriate conduct, allegations, never proven in court, that she had exploited some of the vulnerable boys in her care, pressuring them into sexual relationships. Those allegations were disturbing, and while they hadn't led to formal charges at the time, they painted a picture of Johanna as a woman who routinely crossed boundaries and manipulated those around her for her own purposes. By mid-August 2016, as Göran's murder and the attempted murder of his wife were under intense investigation, Johanna Müller and Mohammed Rajabi had become the prime suspects. This was not a conclusion reached lightly. It was a development driven by accumulating evidence and intuition. Some of that intuition came from the victim herself, the mother's warning about her daughter, but tangible evidence was also beginning to surface. One of the neighbours near Lake Hjälmaren reported something odd. On the night of August 2nd, they had noticed an unfamiliar car driving on the small gravel road near the Möller's cottage around midnight. It was a dark-coloured or possibly orange vehicle with 2 people inside. The sighting hadn't made much sense at the time, just a car passing in the night. But after news of the attack emerged, the neighbour remembered it. The detail about an orange car was striking. Göran's daughter Johanna happened to drive an orange Volkswagen Touran. There were not many orange family cars on the roads of that area. The colour was distinctive. Police quietly confirmed that Johanna did own an orange VW Touran and used it regularly. If she had indeed been at the summer house that night, that could have been the car seen near the scene. But Johanna had told relatives and presumably the police that she was at her own home in Eskilstuna on the night of the attack. Eskilstuna is roughly a 40-minute drive from Arboga, close enough for a round trip in one night, but Johanna insisted she never left home. To support her alibi, Johanna pointed out that several of her children were with her that evening. In fact, her 13-year-old son initially told police that he remembered his mother being home through the night. It looked, on the surface, like Johanna had an ironclad alibi within the walls of her own home. But inconsistencies soon emerged. Investigators found reasons to doubt the alibi. Perhaps the other children in the home had been asleep and didn't actually see Johanna all night. Perhaps Johanna had deliberately put her phone on the nightstand and left it behind, so that its signal would suggest she stayed in Eskilstuna. It wouldn't be the first time a suspect tried such a trick. Detectives also learned that earlier on August 2nd, Johanna had unexpectedly taken her younger children away from the cottage, where they had been staying with their grandparents. She brought the kids back to Eskilstuna that day, leaving Göran and his wife alone at the summer house for the first time in weeks. At the time, no one thought much of it. Johanna claimed she needed her children home for some reason. In hindsight, that action looked calculated, as if Johanna wanted her parents isolated that night with no potential witnesses in the house. Confronted with rising suspicion, Johanna Müller vehemently denied any role in her father's death or her mother's injuries. She agreed to talk with police in the days after the attack, and her statements were a tangle of deflections. According to investigators, Johanna cycled through multiple explanations of her own whereabouts and actions on the night of the crime, each story stranger than the last. At one point, she claimed she had indeed left her house in the middle of the night, not to go to Arboga and harm her parents, but for an entirely unrelated escapade. She said she had driven off to meet someone to purchase an illegal firearm, or bizarrely, to engage in sex work for extra money. In another version, she maintained she never left home at all that night. The sheer number of conflicting stories only deepened the detectives' skepticism. Every time Johanna offered a new alibi, the police went to work checking it, and every time they found evidence that poked holes in her account. It seemed as if Johanna Müller was scrambling to throw off the investigation by any means necessary. Meanwhile, the police were also keeping a close eye on Mohammed Rajabi. Rajabi had been staying in Johanna's household, but in the aftermath of the attack, he lay low and largely stayed out of sight. When questioned, he echoed Johanna's denials. He claimed to know nothing about the crime at the cottage. Given his status as effectively a family friend or foster son, there was no obvious reason for him to be at the Müller's summer house that night, unless he was involved in the attack. Detectives noticed that Rajabi had some fresh scratch marks on his hands and arms, which he awkwardly explained away as accidents or the result of roughhousing. Such scratches could be defensive wounds from a victim fighting back. It was not conclusive evidence on its own, but it raised eyebrows. Quietly, investigators collected a DNA sample from Rajabi, as well as from Johanna and other family members, to compare against any forensic evidence from the crime scene. Forensic technicians had combed through the bedroom and the victim's clothing for clues. One crucial piece of evidence came from under Göran Möller's fingernails. In the struggle for his life, Göran had managed to claw at his assailant. In doing so, he had scraped off bits of skin or blood that lodged beneath his nails. Lab analysts zeroed in on this material and extracted a DNA profile. It did not match Göran or his wife, which meant it almost certainly came from the intruder. At first, this DNA profile didn't match anyone in the criminal databases. The attacker was not someone previously known to police. But when investigators compared it to the DNA swabs taken from suspects in the Möller case, there was a match. The DNA under Göran's fingernails matched Mohammed Rajabi. In that instant, a scientific thread tied the young man from Johanna's home directly to the bloodied bed where Göran was killed. He had been there, in that cottage, despite all his claims to the contrary. As the forensic net tightened, police also got another breakthrough, this time from Johanna Möller's own car. Investigators had seized Johanna's orange Volkswagen for examination. It was a 7-seater family car, the kind where you could fold down seats for extra cargo, useful for hauling children or luggage, or perhaps other things. Forensic examiners went over the vehicle inch by inch. In the rear cargo area, the trunk space, they applied luminol, a chemical that reveals traces of blood even if someone has tried to clean them. Sure enough, the floor of the trunk reacted. There were faint blood traces soaked into the fibers of the carpeting. Further testing confirmed the blood was human, and not just any human. It matched Göran Möller's blood type and DNA. This meant that something, or someone, covered in Göran's blood had been inside Johanna's car not long after the murder. The conclusion was straightforward. After the attack, the perpetrators had likely placed evidence, possibly the murder weapon, their bloody clothing, or other items, into Johanna's trunk to transport or dispose of it. Even a careful cleanup couldn't remove all the clues. A few nearly invisible drops of Göran's blood ended up betraying the killer's steps. By mid-August, the evidence against Johanna and Mohammed was mounting, but the pair remained defiant and, critically, still free. Investigators knew they had to act quickly if they were going to prevent their suspects from fleeing. They got their chance on August 16, 2016, exactly 2 weeks after the attack. That day, Johanna Möller and Mohammed Rajabi arrived at Stockholm's Arlanda International Airport with luggage in hand and tickets booked for a flight abroad. Their destination was Thailand, a tourist getaway for many Swedes, but to police it looked like an escape route. Johanna had told acquaintances she planned to take a vacation to Thailand with Mohammed. To the authorities, the timing was far too coincidental. Leaving the country in the middle of an active murder investigation, just when the clues were pointing toward her, raised every alarm bell. As Johanna and Mohammed made their way through the airport, they were unaware that Swedish police were already there, watching and waiting. Detectives had obtained warrants to arrest them on suspicion of murder and attempted murder. The moment Johanna and her young companion appeared at the departure gate, officers moved in. In a matter of seconds, Johanna Möller, a mother of 5, former social worker, and recently widowed daughter of the victim, found herself in handcuffs, along with the quiet young man she claimed was only her tenant. Passers-by at the airport might have seen a middle-aged woman in casual travel clothes and a younger man being escorted away by police, not realizing they were witnessing the climax of an international manhunt in the making. Johanna and Mohammed were taken into custody and brought to the Västerås police station for interrogation. It was a pivotal moment in the case. Detectives finally had both prime suspects in custody. When an investigator laid out the suspicions that she was behind not only her father's murder, but also possibly her husband's death the year before, Johanna erupted. "When did I become a mass murderer?" she blurted out incredulously. To her interrogators, it was a telling choice of words, mass murderer, as if she saw herself being painted as a monster by the authorities. They were indeed beginning to suspect Johanna of multiple killings, but it was her own behavior that had drawn that suspicion. Despite their confidence in the evidence, prosecutors at that point faced a challenge. Swedish law is protective of individual liberty. Without a solid case ready, the suspects could not be held indefinitely. After a few days of intense questioning, the evidence in hand was still largely circumstantial. The DNA and blood tests were either still being processed or not yet formally presented. The arrest at the airport had been based on urgent suspicion, but formal charges required more. So on August 19th, 2016, just 3 days after they had dramatically detained her, the authorities had to release Johanna Möller and Mohammed Rajabi from custody, at least for the time being. They walked out of the police station free, but certainly not cleared. It was a risky move to let them go, but investigators were not abandoning the case. Far from it. In fact, they immediately shifted to a covert surveillance strategy. Johanna and Mohammed were now acutely aware that they were suspects, but perhaps they felt they'd outsmarted the police and gotten away with it. Officers trailed them at a discreet distance. More importantly, with court approval, the police secretly installed listening devices in Johanna's car and, reportedly, in her home. If Johanna and Mohammed thought they could relax and discuss their next moves, they were mistaken. Virtually every word they spoke to each other over the following days would be recorded. The strategy paid dividends almost at once. As Johanna and Mohammed drove away from the police station and over the next several days, their private conversations inside the car were indeed revealing. Investigators listening in heard a very different tone from the confident denials the pair had maintained in official interrogations. Johanna, especially, was caught in a candid mode, one perhaps born of panic. On one recording, her voice is low and urgent as she coaches Mohammed on what to do if they're questioned again. "You must keep quiet," she is heard telling him. "Not a word. We have to stick to our story. Do you understand? Deny everything." There's a hard edge to her instructions, almost a threat beneath the surface. "I don't want to be convicted of murder or as an accomplice and sit in prison for 10 years, she added. Mohammed's responses were quieter, often just acknowledgements. The dynamic was clear. Johanna was in charge, directing the young man on how to protect them both. In another intercepted exchange, Johanna and Mohammed discussed their plans for the immediate future. The heat was on them in Sweden, and it seems Johanna had no intention of staying to face a possible trial. She spoke about leaving the country as soon as possible, a permanent escape this time, not just a holiday jaunt to Thailand. They contemplated marriage as well. It might have been a genuine idea. Perhaps Johanna thought if they married, it could give Mohammed stronger legal ties to her or impede investigators. Or it might have been a ploy to keep Mohammed loyal, binding him with promises of a life together abroad. On the tapes, Johanna's tone oscillated between affection and stern coaching. She reassured him that if they just held firm a little longer, they would be safe. They would run, start fresh somewhere else, and no one would find them. These covert recordings were exactly what the police had hoped for, real-time evidence of consciousness of guilt. Innocent people do not sit in their cars urging each other to deny everything and plotting immediate flights from the country. The surveillance confirmed that Johanna and Mohammed were not only complicit, but actively scheming to evade justice. However, the authorities knew they needed to catch them before they disappeared for good. Johanna's aborted trip to Thailand had been one attempt. She might very well try another, especially now that she had been briefly locked up. Keeping track of her was critical. Only a week after their release, Johanna Möller and Mohammed Rajabi slipped out of Sweden, but not in the way they had imagined. Sometime in late August 2016, the pair managed to cross the border into neighbouring Norway, likely travelling by car or train. Perhaps they thought going via Norway, without the heightened scrutiny they now faced at Swedish airports, was a safer bet. Whether they intended to stay in Norway or move onward isn't certain. Trondheim, a city in central Norway, became their destination, or at least a waypoint. By then, however, Swedish police had pieced together enough hard evidence to obtain an international arrest warrant. With the DNA match from Göran's nails and the blood in the car formally documented, plus the highly incriminating recordings, prosecutors were ready to charge Johanna and Mohammed properly. They alerted their Norwegian counterparts that these two suspects were likely on the move. On August 30th, 2016, Norwegian police, acting on Sweden's request, located Johanna Möller and Mohammed Rajabi holed up in a hostel in the city of Trondheim. In a coordinated operation, Norwegian officers arrested them without incident. The fugitives' plan, whatever it was, had unraveled. Within days, Johanna and Mohammed were handed over to Swedish authorities and transported back across the border. This time, there would be no quick release. They were formally remanded into custody on strong probable cause, facing charges of murder and attempted murder for the attack on Johanna's parents. With Johanna safely behind bars, investigators took the opportunity to delve further into the 2015 drowning of her husband, Aki Pasila. The parallels between the cases were impossible to ignore now. Both times, Johanna had been present in some fashion, had something significant to gain, and had acted in ways that raised post hoc suspicion. In November, the decision was made to exhume Aki Pasila's body from its grave for a second autopsy. Forensic pathologists re-examined the remains, looking for any signs of foul play that might have been missed the first time. They were also armed with new information, the insurance angle. That autumn, investigators had uncovered a startling financial motive related to Aki's death. Johanna Möller had taken out a hefty life insurance policy on Aki about half a year before he died, and it turned out she had done so by forging his signature on the paperwork. The insurance company, If, had smelt something fishy immediately after Aki's drowning. They found it odd that Johanna was so quick to claim the payout. Their internal investigation revealed that Aki likely never knew about the policy at all. Because of this, the insurer had actually withheld payment. They flagged the case to the police as a possible insurance fraud and potentially a murder for profit. Bolstered by the insurer's information, prosecutors later alleged that Johanna had been plotting to kill her husband for over a year. They gathered testimony and evidence suggesting Johanna had even tried to eliminate Aki through more subtle means before resorting to the drowning. Witnesses came forward to report that, a few months prior to his death, Aki had become violently ill under suspicious circumstances. On a trip abroad, he suddenly sickened with symptoms that hinted at poisoning. He survived that episode, but it was inexplicable at the time. In retrospect, prosecutors believed Johanna might have administered something, perhaps a drug or toxin, to weaken him or make it appear he had health issues, softening the ground for an accident later. Then, in August 2015, with a fraudulent life insurance policy in place, Johanna chose the setting of the family's summer cottage for the final act. The allegation was that she somehow incapacitated Aki, maybe with a drug or a blow, and left him in the shallow lake to drown, staging it as a boating mishap. At the time, no obvious injuries had been noted on his body, and without toxicology at the ready, it passed as an accident. Now, with the exhumation, they hoped to find traces of any foul play, perhaps signs of a struggle, or residual chemicals in his system. The second autopsy, however, was inconclusive. After a year in the ground, and with water damage from the drowning, there was little definitive that pathologists could glean to overturn the original findings. There were no clear marks of violence on Aki's remains. If poison had been used, it had long metabolized away. The exhumation did establish one thing firmly. Aki had water in his lungs and had died by drowning. But it could not show beyond doubt whether that drowning was homicide or a tragic accident. Regardless, prosecutors pressed forward with the theory that Johanna had orchestrated her husband's death. They now had enough circumstantial evidence of motive and planning to include it in the case. In addition to murder and attempted murder charges for the Cottage attack, Johanna Möller was charged with solicitation or instigation of the murder of Aki Pasila in 2015, as well as with fraud and forgery related to the life insurance. It was a staggering collection of accusations. Essentially, that Johanna was at the center of a deadly web of crimes against her own family, driven by greed and lust for control. Throughout the pre-trial phase and the compilation of evidence, Johanna Möller remained in custody. Those who observed her noted her extraordinary determination to manipulate events even from behind bars. Unable to communicate freely by phone, Johanna resorted to writing letters and even passing surreptitious notes to people on the outside. Some of these letters were later intercepted by prison authorities. In them, Johanna attempted to script an alternate reality. She begged or instructed certain family members to provide false alibis for her. One letter to a friend boldly asked the person to claim they had all been together on the night of the murder. A blatant request to lie under oath should it come to that. In another note, Johanna tried to coach one of her own children to change their story. She urged them to remember that she had been home the entire night and to stick by that statement. These desperate missives never had the intended effect. The recipients either handed them over to police or the notes were confiscated. Instead of exonerating Johanna, they became damning evidence of consciousness of guilt. The prosecution would later point to this jailhouse scheming as proof that Johanna knew she was caught and was frantically trying to tamper with witnesses. One of Johanna's children did indeed recant an earlier statement, but not in the way Johanna wanted. Her 13-year-old son, who had initially said his mother never left home on the night of August 2nd, eventually admitted that he had lied under pressure. In a later interview, away from his mother's influence, the boy told authorities that Johanna had instructed him explicitly on what to tell the police. In truth, he wasn't absolutely sure whether she was home all night. He had gone to bed, and at some point during the night he thought he heard the car being used. He confessed that he repeated his mother's version of events because he was scared to do otherwise. It was a heartbreaking detail, a child caught between love, fear, and the truth, and it further undermined Johanna's credibility. By the spring of 2017, investigators had assembled a comprehensive case, and the suspects would finally face the verdict of a courtroom. The trial of Johanna Möller and Mohammed Rajabi began in April 2017 at the Västmanland District Court. It quickly became one of the most high-profile criminal trials in Sweden's recent memory. The press dubbed it the Arboga Summer Cottage murder case, and Johanna, now widely known as Arboga Kvinnan, the Arboga woman, was the subject of intense public fascination and revulsion. During the trial, prosecutors laid out their narrative in meticulous detail. They described how Johanna Möller's motivations boiled down to money and a desire for dominance. She had been in a precarious financial position. Despite outward appearances, she needed funds. Her husband's death, they argued, was her first attempt at solving her money problems. A large insurance payout awaited, if only his accidental death could be achieved and believed. When that didn't pan out as cleanly, since the insurance company refused to pay her after discovering the forgery, Johanna turned her sights on her own parents. But Johanna did not wield the knife herself, they said. Instead, she manipulated someone else to do it. In this, they described Mohammed Rajabi as both a victim of Johanna's manipulation and a perpetrator in his own right. He was young, impressionable, and besotted with Johanna. She had lured him with promises of love, sex, perhaps even the prospect of marriage and a stable life, things a lonely refugee teenager found immensely compelling. And then she had groomed him into a tool for violence. Text messages and witness accounts revealed that Johanna had repeatedly discussed dark topics with Rajabi in the weeks before the murder. She spoke of her hatred for her father, of how she'd be better off if he was gone. Step by step, she eroded the moral barriers until Rajabi was willing to do the unthinkable for her. There was also testimony about Johanna's attempts to cover her tracks. A police technician described finding the charred remnants of clothes and shoes in a fire pit behind Johanna's house. It appeared that someone had burned a pile of men's clothing not long after August 3rd, 2016, possibly to destroy bloody garments. It was impossible to prove those were the clothes Mohammed wore during the attack, but the timing and secrecy were hard to explain away. When it came time for the defense, Johanna Möller maintained her innocence with fervor. Her lawyers argued that the evidence was circumstantial or misinterpreted. Yes, Mohammed's DNA was at the scene, but that, Johanna claimed, was entirely possible without her involvement. The defense floated alternate theories, but had difficulty making them stick. As for Mohammed Rajabi, at first he too denied everything. Being tried alongside Johanna put him in a complicated position. If he admitted to the stabbing, he would be confirming much of the prosecution's case. If he continued to deny it, he risked a very long sentence with little leniency. Partway through the trial, Rajabi's stance shifted. The weight of the evidence, the certainty of the DNA, and perhaps pangs of conscience led him to reconsider. In a dramatic turn, Mohammad Rajabi chose to come clean, at least to a substantial degree. Taking the stand, in a halting voice, he confessed to the attack on Göran Möller and his wife. He described the night of August 2nd, 2016, in detail that only the perpetrator could know. Mohammed testified that Johanna had driven him to the cottage under cover of darkness. She had been the one to hand him a knife, he said, and to instruct him on what to do. In his telling, Johanna waited outside, near the door or in the car, while he crept into the cottage sometime after midnight. It was completely dark inside. He made his way to the small bedroom and, steeling himself, launched the knife attack on the sleeping couple. Mohammed admitted he stabbed Göran first, repeatedly, as the older man awoke in confusion and pain. Göran fought back hard for his life, hence the scratches on Mohammed's arms, but Mohammed was younger and armed. After Göran was incapacitated, Mohammed turned the blade on Göran's wife, who by then was screaming and trying to fend him off. He stabbed her several times as well, until she stopped moving. Mohammed recalled the horror of those moments, the sound of the victim's screams, the sight of the blood, and he hung his head on the stand, reportedly crying as he spoke. He said that he realized even as he was doing it, that it was wrong, but that Johanna's influence over him had been so strong, he felt he had no choice. After it was done, he ran out to Johanna, shaking and terrified at what he had done. Johanna, according to his testimony, was waiting exactly where she said she would be. She was composed and focused. Together they sped away from the scene, the orange Volkswagen carrying them through the dark country roads back towards Eskilstuna. On the way, they disposed of the evidence. Mohammed directed investigators to a specific bridge over the Eskilstuna River. With his help, divers later searched the waters below and, remarkably, recovered a knife. The blade was bent and rusted from weeks underwater, but forensic analysis confirmed it was very likely the murder weapon. Traces of Göran's blood still clung in the crevice between the blade and the handle. The location matched Rajabi's story of where they had stopped to throw the knife away that night. In court, Mohammed Rajabi expressed deep remorse. Turning towards Göran's wife, who was present, bravely watching the proceedings from her wheelchair, he offered a tearful apology. He said he was sorry for what he had done and that not a day passed without him regretting his actions. It was a moment of raw emotion that contrasted with Johanna's demeanour. Throughout her former lover's confession, Johanna sat stone-faced, occasionally shaking her head in dissent. When it was her turn to address the court about these claims, Johanna flatly denied everything once more. She accused Mohammed of lying to reduce his own culpability. She suggested he had created a self-serving story, perhaps coached by police, to pin the blame on her so he might get a lighter sentence. "It's his word against mine," she said, asserting that she had nothing to do with any murder plot. But by then, Johanna's credibility was thoroughly tarnished by the wealth of evidence and her own contradictory statements. Over the course of the trial, one person had to relive the trauma perhaps more than anyone: Göran's wife, Johanna's mother, the lone survivor. She testified about the horror of that night and about her lingering suspicions. It was clear she took no pleasure in seeing her own daughter accused and facing life in prison, yet she did not waver from her belief that Johanna had been behind it all. When asked why she had suspected Johanna from the start, she spoke of changes in Johanna's behaviour in the months before, of unsettling conversations and gut feelings that, tragically, turned out to be warranted. One can only imagine the mix of heartbreak and vindication she felt, hearing Mohammed corroborate that her daughter was indeed at the cottage that night, as she had feared. After several weeks of testimony, cross-examinations, and evidence presentation, the trial neared its end. The public had followed every twist with rapt attention. The judges and jurors retreated to deliberate on the fate of Johanna Möller and Mohammed Rajabi. On August 21st, 2017, the Westmanland District Court delivered its verdict. The courtroom was tense as the judge announced the findings. Johanna Möller, was found guilty on multiple counts. The court pronounced her guilty of the murder of her father, Göran Möller, and the attempted murder of her mother. She was also found guilty of the charges related to her husband's death, specifically guilty of soliciting or instigating the murder of Aki Pasila, as well as of the fraud and forgery connected to the life insurance scheme. In the judge's opinion, the pattern of Johanna's actions was clear and heinous. They noted that it was virtually unheard of in Swedish criminal history for a daughter to commit such acts against her own family. The lead judge spoke somberly of Johanna's complete lack of empathy and the cold-blooded premeditation evident in her crimes. For these crimes, Johanna Möller was sentenced to life in prison. In Sweden, a life sentence is indeterminate, effectively an acknowledgement that the convict should spend the rest of her natural life incarcerated, barring some exceptional circumstances or later clemency. It is the harshest penalty available in the Swedish system, reserved for the worst offences. Johanna, who was 43 by the time of sentencing, stared straight ahead as the judgment was read, betraying little emotion. Mohammed Rajabi, who by then was about 21 years old, was also found guilty of carrying out the murder and attempted murder at the cottage. However, the court took into account his age and the degree to which he had been pressured and influenced by Johanna. They acknowledged his late-stage confession and apparent remorse as mitigating factors as well. Mohammed was sentenced to 14 years in prison. Furthermore, the court ordered that after serving his sentence, Mohammed Rajabi was to be expelled from Sweden, deported to his country of origin, and banned from returning. Considering he was a young man with effectively no prior record, 14 years was a stern sentence, but it offered a possibility that one day, in his mid-30s, he might be free again, albeit not in Sweden. In addition to prison terms, the court mandated Johanna Möller to pay substantial damages to the victims. She was ordered to pay compensation to her mother for the trauma and injuries suffered, and to the estate of her late father. There were also financial penalties for her insurance fraud. The sums ran into the hundreds of thousands of krona. Whether Johanna, now locked away with no income, would ever be able to pay them was doubtful, but it was a symbolic gesture that she should be held financially accountable as well. Johanna's reaction to the verdict was, by many accounts, shock and fury. She immediately declared that she would appeal the decision. In interviews with the press through her lawyer, Johanna insisted that an innocent woman had been condemned and vowed to fight on. The question of Aki Pasila's death remained a point of contention. Even though the district court had convicted Johanna of involvement in that as well, some observers wondered if that piece of the case was truly airtight. The appeals process unfolded over the following months. Mohammed Rajabi did not fight his own conviction. Having confessed and been handed 14 years, he likely knew an appeal could even risk a harsher outcome, so he accepted his fate. Johanna, however, had nothing to lose in pressing every point. In March 2018, the Court of Appeal announced its decision. For the most part, Johanna Möller's convictions were upheld. The appeal did, however, give Johanna one small reprieve. The judges were not convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that Johanna had in fact instigated Aki Pasila's death in 2015. They noted that while Johanna clearly intended to defraud the insurance company, for which her conviction stood, the exact circumstances of Aki's drowning were too murky to label it a murder arranged by her. There simply wasn't incontrovertible evidence that Aki's death had been anything more than an accident. As one appellate judge put it cannot be definitively established how her husband died. With that lingering uncertainty, the court overturned Johanna's conviction for the alleged murder of her husband. In practical terms, this acquittal did not change Johanna's situation much. She was still serving life for her father's murder. But it did mean that in the eyes of the law, Aki Pasila's case remained unresolved and Johanna retained the presumption of innocence for that event. At one point, astonishingly, officials at the Ystad prison discovered that Johanna was trying to orchestrate yet another crime from behind bars. She had approached fellow inmates, asking if they would be willing to kill her mother on the outside. Even after all that had happened, Johanna apparently still wanted her mother dead, the mother who survived and had testified against her. When this plot came to light in late 2018, Johanna was swiftly placed in stricter conditions. It seemed that as long as Johanna retained any power to influence events, she would attempt to do so in the most sinister ways. The Arboga case, as it came to be known, remains one of Sweden's most disturbing criminal sagas. It challenged assumptions about the bonds of family and how far a person might go for money and self-interest. Johanna Möller sits today in a Swedish prison, serving a life sentence that may well ensure she never walks free again. Mohammad Rajabi remains behind bars as well, facing years more before he is released and expelled.